She was one of the richest women in American history. Her name opened doors, silenced questions, and rewrote outcomes. But on a rainy night in 1966, at a locked iron gate in Newport, Rhode Island, a man was crushed between steel and stone, and the story was quietly labeled an accident. No trial, no charges, no real answers. Just money, influence, and silence for decades. People have asked the same question in whispers. Did Doris Duke get away with murder? This is not a story about luxury. It's a story about power, grief, obsession, and what happens when a life of privilege collides with a single irreversible moment. Stay with me, because once this gate opens, it never truly closes again. The ocean was calm the morning Doris Duke disappeared for the final time. There was no storm, no dramatic sky, no omen carved into the horizon. Just water, endless, indifferent, breathing slowly beneath a pale stretch of light. A small boat drifted several miles off the coast, its engine shut down, surrendering to the gentle pull of the Pacific. The silence was intentional. No music, no speeches, no reporters, only a few attendants and the soft slap of water against the hull. The container was plain. No gold, no engraving, no reminder that the ashes inside belonged to one of the wealthiest women in American history. When the lid was opened, the wind hesitated. The ashes lifted in a thin gray ribbon, swirling once, as if resisting release, then scattered across the surface of the sea. For a moment, they hovered, suspended between sky and water, before dissolving into nothing. The Pacific absorbed Doris Duke the same way it absorbs everything else, without comment, without memory, without judgment. It was over in seconds. No one spoke. No one mentioned the Iron Gate. No one said the name Eduardo Terrell. But the silence did not mean peace. It meant avoidance. Because this was never just a story about wealth, estates, or philanthropy. It was a story about control, about loneliness disguised as privilege, about grief that metastasized into obsession, and about one night, one irreversible moment when power and emotion collided at the edge of a locked gate in Newport, Rhode Island. To understand that night, you have to understand the woman who stood behind the wheel. And to understand her, you have to begin far earlier, before the headlines, before the rumors, before the whispers that followed her into death. You have to begin with a child who never learned how to be ordinary. Doris Duke was born into a world that did not belong to her. It belonged to her father. James Buchanan Duke was not merely wealthy. He was foundational. Tobacco, electricity, banking, philanthropy, entire systems bent around his decisions. He was a man who did not ask whether something could be built. He asked how fast and how completely it could be controlled. When Doris was born in 1912, she did not enter a family so much as an empire. Her earliest memories were not of affection, but of scale. Rooms large enough to swallow sound, corridors where footsteps echoed too long, landscapes manicured to the point where nature felt staged. Duke Farms in New Jersey was not a home. It was a monument, acres upon acres of land, greenhouses, fountains, stone paths, and staff moving silently in the background, trained to anticipate needs before they were voiced. Her father was present, but distant, not cruel, not neglectful, simply occupied by forces larger than family. Doris saw him the way one sees a mountain, immovable, commanding, rarely approached. Her mother, Nanoline, embodied refinement without warmth. She believed in composure, in appearances, in discipline. Emotional intimacy was not part of her vocabulary. Love was expressed through structure, not touch, through expectation, not reassurance. From the beginning, Doris learned a dangerous lesson. Everything around her existed because of power, not connection. She learned to observe quietly, to move carefully, to sense the moods of adults who spoke around her, but rarely to her. Servants watched her constantly, correcting posture, guiding behavior, shaping her into something appropriate long before she understood what was being demanded. She was never allowed to disappear into childhood, and yet, like all children, she searched for moments of escape. She wandered the edges of Duke Farms alone, walking tree-lined paths where the air felt less controlled. In winter, snow softened the estate into something quieter, gentler. The vastness became muffled. The expectations dulled. Snow became her first refuge because it erased detail, blurred structure, and offered temporary silence. Those moments mattered more than anyone realized, because they were the only times Doris felt unobserved. In 1925, when Doris was 12 years old, her father died. The world responded immediately. Lawyers, trustees, documents, meetings, structures snapping into place with mechanical precision. James Buchanan. Duke had not trusted fate with his fortune. He had designed it to outlive him intact. His will did more than distribute wealth. It dictated time. Doris would not receive her inheritance freely. It would be parceled out in stages. Controlled, monitored, released gradually. Trusts within trusts. Oversight layered upon oversight. Protection, they called it. But protection has a cost. Even as a teenager, Doris Duke became one of the richest individuals in the United States. Newspapers printed her name. Society whispered it. Adults measured her worth in figures too large to conceptualize. And yet, she owned nothing outright. Not her money, not her time, not her future. She was rich, and she was managed. This contradiction would define her entire life. At 14, tutors replaced school. Languages, literature, history, etiquette. Her intelligence was evident. She absorbed knowledge quickly, quietly. But education was not meant to free her. It was meant to prepare her to perform. Every lesson came with an unspoken conclusion. You will represent something larger than yourself. Her adolescence unfolded under constant supervision. Invitations arrived before she was ready. Strangers commented on her future as if it were already written. She listened as adults speculated about her marriages, her role, her eventual control of a fortune she had never asked for. She learned another lesson during these years, one that would scar her deeply. People behaved differently around money. They softened their voices, adjusted their posture, hid their intentions behind charm or admiration. Authenticity became difficult to locate. Everyone wanted something. Even kindness felt transactional. Doris grew observant, not shy. She watched, and she remembered. By the time she was introduced to society, Doris Duke had perfected composure. Her debut was elegant, controlled, appropriate. The press praised her beauty, her grace, her reserve. She was compared endlessly to Barbara Hutton, another heiress navigating the same gilded expectations. They were called the Gold Dust Twins, as if wealth erased individuality. But behind the polished smile, Doris felt detached. She did not crave attention. She endured it. Society events felt like rehearsals for a role she never auditioned for. Conversations circled predictably. Travel, fashion, influence. Men approached her carefully, measuring their words. Women watched her with curiosity or calculation. And beneath it all, Doris felt the same quiet hunger she had known as a child, a desire to be seen as a person. Not a fortune. She did not rebel. She complied. But compliance is not acceptance. It is endurance. Her first marriage, to James Jimmy Cromwell, appeared to offer escape. He was older, politically ambitious, articulate. He spoke to her directly, without reverence. For the first time, Doris felt addressed rather than assessed. Their conversation stretched beyond appearances, into ideas, politics, the world beyond ballrooms. She married him believing she had chosen something for herself. The marriage began with travel, exploration, expansion. Doris discovered cultures, art, architecture. Her curiosity flourished. She felt briefly untethered from the rigid structures of her upbringing. Then came the child, or rather, the loss of one. In 1940, Doris gave birth prematurely. The baby lived for one day. One. The hospital room became hollow, time distorted, words lost shape. And in the aftermath came the final blow. Medical complications meant she would never safely carry another child. The possibility of motherhood, never fully imagined, never consciously desired, was gone, taken before it could be grieved. This loss fractured something fundamental. Jimmy tried to move forward. Doris could not. Their grief diverged. His ambition pulled him outward. Hers collapsed inward. When he accepted diplomatic appointments, the distance became physical as well as emotional. The marriage dissolved quietly. No scandal, no spectacle, just absence. Doris retreated to Hawaii. There, she built Shangri-La, a sanctuary overlooking black volcanic rock and endless ocean. She filled it with art, Islamic patterns, Southeast Asian influences. She poured herself into creation, into beauty, into control over environment. For a time, it worked, but grief is patient. It does not demand attention. It waits. Doris began to drink alone, then regularly. Doctors prescribed medications without restraint. Sleep, nerves, pain, everything could be adjusted chemically. No one denied her access. No one challenged her habits. Why would they? She was Doris Duke, and Doris Duke paid well. She sought answers beyond reason, spiritualism, mediums, signs. She wanted to believe that death was not final, that something of her child remained reachable, that separation was temporary. These pursuits brought comfort, but also dependency. Reality blurred. Control slipped. Her second marriage, to Porfirio Rubirosa, burned brightly and briefly. He was charming, magnetic, unapologetically ambitious. The press adored him. The warnings came early about his motives, his history, his appetite for wealth. Doris ignored them. She wanted intensity. She wanted to feel chosen. The marriage was extravagant, volatile, transactional in ways she refused to acknowledge. Gifts flowed, money flowed. Loyalty did not. When it ended, Doris was left with a familiar sensation. Betrayal layered atop loneliness. She withdrew again, this time, deeper, by the 1960s. Doris Duke was a paradox, a philanthropist revered publicly, a recluse privately, a woman surrounded by people yet fundamentally alone. She returned often to Rough Point, her Newport estate perched above the Atlantic. The house was imposing, austere, heavy with history. The wind there carried a sharpness that felt intentional, as if the coast itself were hostile. Among the few people Doris trusted was Eduardo Terrell. He was her curator, her confidant in art, a steady presence in a life defined by instability. Eduardo understood aesthetics, history, and restraint. He spoke to Doris without fear or flattery. For years, their relationship was professional, calm, dependable, until it wasn't. Eduardo had decided to leave. He had opportunities in Hollywood, a future independent of her orbit. He came to Rough Point on October 6, 1966, to tell her goodbye. The weather turned. Rain slicked the driveway. The iron gate stood closed at the entrance. Their conversation grew tense. Doris had always struggled with abandonment. Loss was not something she processed well. They walked together toward the car. Eduardo stepped out to open the gate. The engine was running. What happened next would define Doris Duke forever. She said her foot slipped. The car surged forward. Metal met stone. A body was crushed. Eduardo Terrell died pinned against the gate, and the world would never agree on whether it was an accident. But that is where this story truly begins, because what followed was not justice. It was silence, and silence, when backed by wealth, is a powerful thing. The ocean that received Doris Duke's ashes did not remember her, but the gate at Rough Point still does. Long before Doris Duke became a headline, before her name carried the weight of suspicion and silence, she was a child learning an unspoken rule of her world. Nothing belonged to her, not even herself. She was born into power so vast that it erased normal human proportions. Everything around her was oversized: rooms, land, expectations, distance. Duke Farms was not a place designed for warmth. It was designed for permanence. Stone paths stretched farther than a child's legs wanted to walk. Trees were planted in deliberate rows. Nature disciplined into obedience. Even the air felt managed. From her earliest days, Doris sensed that the estate was not built for joy. It was built to endure. James Buchanan Duke did not raise his daughter the way ordinary fathers did. He did not come home exhausted and remove his jacket with relief. He did not sit at the table and ask about her day. He arrived like a force, contained, deliberate, commanding. When he entered a room, conversations changed shape. People straightened. Decisions followed him like shadows. To Doris, he was not unkind, but he was unreachable. She watched him from doorways, from staircases, from the edges of rooms where adults spoke in controlled tones. His affection, when it appeared, was brief and formal: a hand on the shoulder, a nod of approval. Praise was rare. Disappointment was silent, and therefore heavier. Her mother, Nanoline, filled the house with elegance but little comfort. She moved through life as if it were a social performance that could not be paused. Her voice was calm, her gestures restrained. Emotions were not expressed, they were managed. If Doris cried, it was addressed quietly. If she questioned, she was redirected. If she resisted, she was corrected. Love was never loud in that house. It was implied, and implied love is difficult for a child to feel. Doris learned early that she was being shaped. Her clothes were chosen for her, her posture corrected, her speech refined. Meals were timed, lessons scheduled, play supervised. She was not encouraged to explore freely. She was guided, watched, adjusted. Servants became her constant companions, but never her equals. They cared for her deeply. Yet there was always a line they could not cross. Affection had boundaries. Familiarity was discouraged. Even comfort came with restraint. Doris grew up surrounded by people who would never be allowed to truly know her, and she felt it. She became quiet, not out of fear, but out of observation. Silence became a survival skill. When you listen long enough, you learn how power moves. You learn who speaks freely and who measures every word. You learn which emotions are welcome and which are inconvenient. Doris learned to keep her inner world private. That privacy would later harden into isolation. There were moments, rare, fragile, when the estate softened. Winter was her favorite season. Snow transformed Duke Farms into something unrecognizable. The sharp lines blurred. The land hushed itself. Sound disappeared into white. Expectations paused. Snow did something no one else could. It made the world quiet enough for Doris to breathe. She would stand by tall windows watching flakes fall, each one brief, delicate, unimportant on its own, but together capable of changing everything. In snow, the estate felt less like a monument and more like a place that could be lived in. Those moments mattered because they gave her a sense of impermanence. Everything else in her life felt fixed. When James Buchanan Duke died in 1925, Doris was 12. She did not fully understand death yet, but she understood absence. The house changed immediately. Lawyers arrived. Meetings filled rooms once reserved for family. Papers replaced voices. Decisions were made about her life without her presence. No one asked what she wanted. They asked what was safest. Her father's will was not simply a document. It was a system, a machine designed to protect wealth from human error. Trusts unfolded according to age, not readiness. Oversight was absolute. To the adults around her, this was wisdom. To Doris, it felt like being inherited by strangers. She became an heiress overnight, but not a free one. Her life was now governed by schedules written in ink long before she could question them. Money flowed around her, but rarely to her. Every allowance, every expenditure, every decision passed through layers of approval. Even grief was structured. There were no emotional breakdowns allowed, no public vulnerability. She was expected to carry her father's legacy with composure, to behave as if loss were an inconvenience rather than a wound. Doris complied. She always complied. But compliance does not erase pain. It buries it. As adolescence arrived, so did attention. Her name began appearing in newspapers. Society columns speculated about her future. Adults spoke about her as if she were an investment waiting to mature. She heard herself discussed in the third person while standing in the same room. She'll inherit everything. She must be protected. She's going to be watched. Watched. That word followed her. Tutors replaced classmates. Education became a private affair. Languages, history, literature, etiquette, all delivered with precision. Doris excelled. Intelligence came naturally to her. But learning felt disconnected from purpose. Education was not meant to prepare her for independence. It was meant to prepare her for expectation. Every lesson ended at the same destination: representation. She would represent the Duke name, the Duke fortune, the Duke legacy. Who she actually was mattered far less. Wealth altered the behavior of everyone around her. Doris noticed it early. Adults softened their voices. Compliments felt excessive. Interest felt calculated. Even kindness seemed to carry an agenda. People smiled too carefully, listened too attentively. Money distorted sincerity. She did not become arrogant. She became cautious. She learned to read people the way others read weather: subtle shifts, changes in tone, hidden pressure. She could tell when admiration turned into expectation, when affection turned into entitlement. This awareness protected her, but it also isolated her. Trust became rare. By the time she entered society, Doris Duke was already exhausted. Her debut was flawless. Gowns chosen, words rehearsed, smiles measured. The press adored her restraint. She was beautiful, composed, unreachable, exactly what was expected, inside. She felt nothing. Society gatherings blurred together. Conversations repeated themselves. People treated her as an idea rather than a person. She became known as reserved, shy, mysterious. The truth was simpler. She was detached. She watched from within rooms filled with laughter, feeling as though she were behind glass. Everyone wanted proximity to her wealth, but no one asked what it was like to live inside it. She did not rebel. She waited. Waiting became her habit. When Jimmy Cromwell entered her life, it felt different. He spoke to her without reverence. He had ambitions of his own. He did not orbit her wealth. He walked beside it. Doris felt acknowledged rather than managed, for the first time. She believed she had chosen something. Marriage felt like agency. Travel opened her mind. The world expanded beyond estates and expectations. Art, culture, architecture. Doris absorbed it all hungrily. She felt alive in motion. Then everything stopped. The child arrived too soon. One day of life, one day of hope. Then silence. The hospital room was sterile, indifferent. Doctors spoke carefully. Doris heard the words, but could not feel them. Grief did not explode. It collapsed inward. And then came the final cruelty. She would never safely carry another child. The future she had never allowed herself to imagine vanished before it could exist. This loss broke her in ways no one recognized. Jimmy wanted to move forward. Doris could not. Their marriage did not end in anger. It ended in distance, quiet, unavoidable, absolute. She had lost a child. She had lost a marriage. And she had lost the illusion that structure could protect her from pain. By the time Doris retreated to Hawaii, she was already unraveling. Shangri-La was beautiful, deliberate, controlled. She filled it with art and history. She tried to build a sanctuary where chaos could not enter. But grief is not impressed by beauty. It slips through. Alcohol softened the edges of her days. Medications dulled her nights. Doctors obliged. No one said no. Why would they? She was Doris Duke. She searched for meaning where reason failed her. Spiritualism offered possibility. Mediums offered hope. She wanted to believe death was porous, that separation was temporary. Some of these beliefs comforted her. Others deepened her dependency. Reality became flexible. Control loosened. By the time she returned to Rough Point in later years, Doris Duke was no longer the composed debutante. She was a woman shaped by absence. She trusted few people. Eduardo Terrell was one of them. He did not treat her like a fortune. He treated her like a collaborator. He understood art, restraint, boundaries. He did not fear her power. That trust mattered more than anyone realized, because when Eduardo decided to leave, it triggered something far older than anger. It triggered abandonment. And Doris Duke had never learned how to survive that. Not as a child, not as an adult, not as the woman standing behind the wheel on a rainy night in Newport. This is where the story tightens, because everything that happened at the gate was already written long before metal met stone. It was written in silence, in distance, in a childhood where power replaced connection, in a life where loss was managed instead of healed, in a woman who had been watched her entire life but never truly held. And once you understand that, the question changes. It's no longer just what happened at Rough Point. It becomes, could it have ended any other way? By the time Doris Duke understood what money was, it was already controlling her life. Not in the glamorous way people imagine. No spontaneous shopping sprees. No reckless indulgence. No sense of freedom. Quite the opposite. Her wealth did not liberate her. It confined her. It wrapped itself around every decision, every relationship, every future possibility like a carefully measured chain. James Buchanan. Duke had not trusted chance, emotion, or even family when it came to his fortune. He trusted systems, paper, law, control. And so when he died, Doris did not inherit wealth. She inherited surveillance. The trustees arrived quietly, efficiently, men in tailored suits who spoke softly but decided absolutely. They did not raise their voices. They did not need to. Their authority came from documents older than Doris's grief. Her father's will was meticulous, coldly brilliant. It specified not just how much Doris would receive, but when, how, and under what conditions. Money would be released in stages, carefully timed to milestones defined by age, not maturity. She would not own the fortune until adulthood. Even then, ownership was theoretical. Every move was observed, every expenditure justified, every decision evaluated for risk. Risk to whom? Not to Doris, to the fortune. From the moment her father died, Doris Duke became something dangerous in the eyes of those tasked with preserving wealth, a human variable, and variables must be controlled. As a teenager, Doris lived surrounded by abundance yet unable to touch it freely. She did not experience poverty, but she did experience restriction. Allowances were generous by ordinary standards, but meaningless compared to what lay locked behind legal barriers. She could not simply decide to go somewhere, to fund something, to give freely. Everything required approval, discussion, delay. Trustees spoke to her politely, but not as an equal. They spoke as caretakers of something far larger than her individual life. They were not villains. They believed they were protecting her. But protection without trust feels indistinguishable from imprisonment. Doris sensed this long before she could articulate it. Her adolescence unfolded in an unnatural environment, while other young people experimented, failed, and learned consequence. Doris existed in a padded reality. Mistakes were minimized, risks were softened, consequences were negotiated away. On the surface, this looked like privilege. Internally, it produced fragility, because resilience is built through experience, not avoidance. Doris was shielded from the ordinary failures that teach people how to recover. When she stumbled emotionally, there were no frameworks to catch her. When she hurt, she had no practice enduring it. Pain did not strengthen her. It destabilized her. By her late teens, the public fascination intensified. Newspapers speculated endlessly. How much was she worth? What would she do with it? Who would she marry? Where would she live? Her identity became inseparable from numbers no one could fully comprehend. She was no longer a person. She was a projection, and projections invite distortion. People imagined her life as effortless, indulgent, charmed. They could not see the constant pressure, the awareness that every decision would be analyzed not for its meaning, but for its impact on legacy. Doris began to withdraw emotionally. Even as her public presence expanded, she learned another dangerous lesson. Visibility does not equal understanding. When Doris finally gained greater access to her fortune, the shift was subtle but profound. Suddenly, doors opened faster. Requests arrived more frequently. People who had once been distant became attentive. Invitations multiplied. Advice flowed freely. Too freely. Everyone had an opinion about what Doris should do with her money: philanthropy, art, politics, influence, control. Few asked what she wanted. Even fewer cared. She discovered that wealth did not simply attract people, it activated them. It sharpened ambition. It exposed entitlement. It encouraged manipulation disguised as guidance. She learned to say yes too often. Saying no felt dangerous, because saying no meant standing alone. Philanthropy became one of the few socially acceptable outlets for her autonomy. Giving allowed Doris to feel purposeful without threatening the structure around her. Trustees encouraged it. Society praised it. Institutions benefited from it. But even generosity was monitored. She learned that charity could be strategic, that donations bought goodwill, loyalty, silence, that money could smooth conflict and soften scrutiny. This realization unsettled her deeply because it meant relationships could be purchased, and anything that can be purchased is not secure. As Doris entered adulthood, the contradiction sharpened. She had more money than nearly anyone in the country. Yet she felt increasingly powerless. Decisions about her life were debated by others. Her reputation was shaped by rumors she could not control. Her relationships were scrutinized for motive. She began to feel like a guest in her own existence. Marriage, when it came, seemed like a way out. Jimmy Cromwell offered escape, not just from loneliness, but from management. He represented choice, partnership, movement, for a brief time. Doris believed love could dissolve the structures that bound her. She was wrong. Marriage did not free her from oversight. It transferred it. Now trustees discussed her decisions through the lens of her husband. New concerns emerged, new evaluations, new risk assessments. Her life became a negotiation between personal desire and institutional preservation. The loss of her child shattered what little illusion remained. Grief was not something the system knew how to process. There were no clauses for despair, no provisions for emotional collapse. Doris was expected to recover quietly. She did not. In the aftermath, Doris's behavior shifted. She became unpredictable, withdrawn, then impulsive, then withdrawn again. Doctors treated symptoms without questioning causes. Trustees adjusted allowances. Staff learned to adapt. No one confronted the core issue, because confronting it meant admitting the system had failed her, and systems protect themselves. As years passed, Doris began to recognize a truth that frightened her. Money could fix outcomes, but not consequences. It could resolve lawsuits. It could quiet scandals. It could smooth reputations, but it could not restore trust. It could not teach her how to lose. It could not prepare her for abandonment, and it could not teach her how to stop herself once emotion overtook reason. By the time Doris reached her 40s, the fortune that was supposed to secure her future had instead hollowed her out. She lived in beautiful places. She owned extraordinary art. She funded meaningful causes. And yet, she felt fundamentally unsafe. Unsafe emotionally. Unsafe relationally. Unsafe within herself. She began to drink not for pleasure, but for quiet. She took medication not for pain, but for numbness. She sought spiritual explanations not because she believed fully, but because uncertainty felt unbearable. Control had been taken from her early. Now she chased it obsessively. Eduardo Terrell entered her life during this fragile equilibrium. He was not impressed by her wealth. He did not ask for favors. He did not position himself strategically. He worked. He contributed. He maintained boundaries. That steadiness mattered, because Doris did not need another admirer. She needed an anchor for years. Eduardo functioned as one, and anchors, once relied upon, become dangerous when they move. When Eduardo decided to leave, he likely saw it as a professional transition. Doris did not. She experienced it as repetition. Another loss, another abandonment, another proof that nothing stays. Not love, not loyalty, not stability, and unlike earlier losses, this one unfolded in real time, on her property, under her authority, in the presence of a vehicle she controlled. The system that had once constrained her was no longer there to intervene. There was no trustee at the gate, no buffer, no delay, only emotion and momentum. This is the part of the story most people misunderstand. They ask whether Doris Duke meant to kill Eduardo Terrell. They debate intention, but intention is the wrong question. The real question is this: what happens when a life built on control finally loses it? Because when control collapses suddenly, the results are rarely gentle. They are abrupt, they are irreversible, and they are often followed by silence. By the time Doris Duke sat behind the wheel at Rough Point, she was not simply a wealthy woman having a bad night. She was the product of decades of management, restriction, unprocessed grief, and learned dependency. She had been protected from consequences her entire life, and protection, when extended too far, becomes permission. Permission to believe that outcomes can always be negotiated, that damage can always be undone, that silence can always be bought. And that belief, whether conscious or not, changes how a person reacts when everything suddenly slips. The gate at Rough Point did not close because of fate. It closed because a system raised a woman who had never learned how to lose control safely, and when that system stepped away, even briefly, it left behind something volatile, something unresolved, something very human. And that is why the night at the gate was not an accident isolated in time. It was an inevitability decades in the making. In the next part, we move closer to the edge, to love, obsession, dependency, and the slow narrowing of Doris Duke's world. Because once control becomes survival, losing it becomes catastrophic. By the time Doris Duke reached her early 20s, there was no such thing as anonymity left in her life. She did not step into rooms anymore. She entered narratives. Every appearance, every photograph, every social engagement was absorbed, interpreted, and repackaged by a public that had decided she belonged to them. Doris Duke was no longer simply alive. She was observed, continuously, relentlessly, intimately. An observation, when constant, becomes a kind of pressure that reshapes the soul. American society in the late 1920s and early 1930s was obsessed with wealth the way it is obsessed with celebrity today. Money wasn't just power, it was mythology. And Doris Duke, young, beautiful, impossibly rich, became one of its most compelling symbols. The press did not ask who she was. They asked what she represented. She was described in headlines as the richest girl in the world, America's princess, the Duke heiress. Her fortune was quantified endlessly, recalculated, compared, exaggerated. Writers speculated openly about how she would spend it, who she would marry, whether she would be generous or reckless, stable or tragic. Before Doris had lived her life, it had already been outlined for public consumption. And once a story is written loudly enough, it becomes difficult to escape. Her debut into society was immaculate. The gowns were flawless, the setting curated, the guests hand-selected. Crystal chandeliers caught the light just right. Music flowed softly. Conversations hummed with approval. Doris Duke performed exactly as expected, composed, elegant, reserved. She smiled at the appropriate moments. She spoke politely. She never revealed too much. The press adored her restraint. They mistook it for mystery. In reality, it was armor. Inside those rooms, Doris felt like she was watching herself from a distance, every movement measured, every reaction monitored. She became acutely aware of her body, how she stood, how she held her hands, how long she met someone's gaze. Nothing was spontaneous. Everything was intentional, and intention, sustained long enough, becomes exhaustion. She was often compared to Barbara Hutton, another heiress of staggering wealth. The media dubbed them the Gold Dust Twins, as if two women could be reduced to a novelty pairing based solely on inherited money. The comparison haunted Doris. Barbara Hutton was flamboyant, emotional, visibly unstable. Doris was quieter, sharper, harder to read. Where Barbara burned, Doris froze, but the public insisted on seeing them as reflections of the same coin. Doris resented the simplification. She did not feel like a twin to anyone. She felt alone. Society gatherings multiplied. Charity dinners, luncheons, balls, fundraisers, introductions, reintroductions. Always someone new wanting a moment of her time, a conversation, a connection. Every interaction carried subtext. Men approached her carefully, performing charm without sincerity, ambition without honesty. Some were intimidated, others were calculating. A few were reckless enough to assume entitlement. Women observed her closely. Some admired her, some resented her. Many measured themselves against her fortune. Very few saw her. Doris learned quickly that in rooms like these, vulnerability was dangerous, so she withdrew inward. There is a particular loneliness that comes from being constantly surrounded. Doris experienced it acutely. She could be in the center of a ballroom and feel invisible. Conversations washed over her without landing. Laughter sounded distant. Compliments felt hollow. She became an observer rather than a participant. This detachment protected her, but it also deepened her isolation. Because detachment, when practiced long enough, becomes habit. At night, after the guests had left and the lights dimmed, Doris often wandered the quiet halls of whatever estate she was staying in. The silence felt honest, unperformative. She could finally breathe. These solitary hours became essential. They were the only times she felt real. But solitude, when prolonged, does not heal. It amplifies. The Great Depression arrived like a reckoning, while millions of Americans lost jobs, homes, and dignity. Doris Duke's wealth insulated her from material hardship, but it did not insulate her from awareness. She saw the contrast clearly. Outside the gates of her world, desperation grew. Inside, luxury persisted. This contradiction troubled her deeply. She felt guilt, but guilt without direction turns into paralysis. She donated generously, funded causes, supported institutions, but philanthropy did not bridge the emotional distance between her life and the lives of ordinary people. It reinforced it. Public fascination intensified. Some admired her generosity. Others criticized her existence as an emblem of inequality. Doris became a lightning rod for national anxieties about wealth, power, and privilege. She did not ask for this role. She could not escape it. The spotlight did not blink. In private, Doris struggled. Her sleep grew irregular. Anxiety crept into her days. She felt pressure constantly to behave correctly, to choose wisely, to never embarrass the legacy she carried. Mistakes felt dangerous, because mistakes, for someone like Doris Duke, were not personal. They were public. This fear of failure became paralyzing. When Jimmy Cromwell entered her life, he felt like relief. He was confident but not awed, intelligent but not reverent. He spoke to Doris as though she were capable, not fragile, not ornamental. For the first time in years, She felt grounded. Marriage appeared not just as romance, but as refuge, a way to redirect the spotlight, a way to become part of a pair instead of a spectacle. But the spotlight does not relinquish easily, even in marriage. Doris remained an object of fascination. The press followed their travels, analyzed their dynamic, speculated about motives. Jimmy's political ambitions only intensified scrutiny. Doris began to realize a painful truth. No matter where she went, she would always be seen before she was known. When she lost her child, the public responded with sympathy, but at a distance. Grief was acknowledged politely, then forgotten. The spotlight moved on. Doris did not. She carried the loss quietly, deeply. It reshaped her interior world, and because she had never learned how to process pain publicly or privately, she internalized it. Grief became something she managed alone, and alone is where it festered. After her marriage began to unravel, Doris withdrew further from society. Appearances became fewer, interactions shorter. She avoided questions, avoided explanations. The press filled the silence with speculation. She became, once again, a projection, a mystery, a woman retreating behind gates. By the time she sought solace in places like Hawaii, Doris Duke was already fractured. The spotlight had shaped her identity without her consent. It had rewarded restraint and punished authenticity. It had taught her to perform stability while suppressing chaos. She had learned to survive under observation, but not how to live without it. And this is crucial to understand, because when a person spends decades under constant scrutiny, privacy becomes not just a preference, but a necessity, and threats to privacy feel like threats to survival. Eduardo Terrell would later become one of the few people allowed into Doris Duke's inner circle during her later years. That trust did not form casually. It formed because Doris had spent a lifetime learning who could be allowed close and who could not. She trusted slowly, and she feared loss intensely, which meant that when Eduardo decided to leave, it was not experienced as a professional change. It was experienced as betrayal amplified by decades of abandonment. The spotlight that followed Doris Duke did not create the tragedy at Rough Point, but it shaped the conditions under which it became possible. It trained her to hide distress, to suppress reaction, to avoid exposure at all costs. And when emotion finally overwhelmed restraint, it happened out of sight, behind a gate, in the rain, without witnesses who could intervene. The spotlight had finally turned away, and that moment of darkness proved fatal. In the next part, we move deeper into intimacy, dependency, and the quiet psychological unraveling that followed Doris Duke into her later years. Because the most dangerous thing about living under constant observation is not that people are watching. It's that eventually, no one is truly seeing you anymore. Marriage was supposed to save Doris Duke, not in the romantic sense the newspapers like to print, but in a quieter, more practical way. Marriage, she believed, would give her gravity. It would anchor her life to something human, something reciprocal, something that existed outside the endless calculations of trustees, reporters, and expectations. With Jimmy Cromwell, she imagined a future that did not revolve entirely around her name. For a brief moment, that future felt possible. Jimmy Cromwell was different from the men Doris had known before. He was older, confident, politically ambitious. He spoke about ideas instead of appearances. He argued. He challenged. He did not orbit her wealth. He treated it as a fact, not a destination. Doris felt, for the first time, that someone was interested in her mind. Not just her inheritance, their courtship was watched closely. Of course, every dinner photographed, every outing dissected, but Doris felt insulated by the sense that she had chosen this path herself. Choice mattered more to her than happiness, because choice meant agency. When they married in 1935, the ceremony was elegant but restrained. Doris did not want spectacle. She wanted privacy, a request that was only partially honored. Still, the marriage marked a turning point. She was no longer just Doris Duke. She was Doris Cromwell. The name felt like relief. They traveled extensively after the wedding: Europe, Asia, the Middle East. For Doris, travel was intoxicating. It loosened the rigid geometry of her life. She wandered through ancient cities, stood beneath structures built long before her father's fortune, and felt, for the first time, small in a way that did not feel threatening. Art captivated her. Architecture fascinated her. Cultures shaped by centuries of belief and tradition stirred something deep within her. She was not merely observing anymore. She was absorbing. Jimmy, meanwhile, spoke often about politics, diplomacy, ambition. He imagined a future in public service, perhaps a role on the international stage. Doris listened attentively. She admired his certainty. She wanted to believe they were building something together. But even in these early days, subtle fractures appeared. Jimmy moved forward. Doris moved inward. They did not yet understand that they were grieving different things, even before the tragedy arrived. In 1940, Doris became pregnant. The news was not announced publicly at first. It was shared cautiously, privately. Doris carried the knowledge quietly, protectively, as though fear itself might endanger it. Motherhood had never been a central dream for her, but now that it was real, it felt monumental. A child would be something untouched by trustees, untouched by press, untouched by inheritance. A child would belong to her in a way nothing else ever had. She allowed herself hope. The labor came too early. There was confusion, urgency, doctors moving quickly. Hospital corridors filled with clipped voices and the smell of antiseptic. Jimmy stood nearby, helpless, watching a process he could not influence with charm or ambition. The child was born alive. A boy, small, fragile, struggling. Doris saw him briefly, held him carefully, memorized his weight, his warmth, the impossibly small curve of his hand. He lived for one day. One. No photographs were taken, no announcements made, no public acknowledgement followed. The world did not pause, but Doris's did. The hospital room after the loss felt unreal. Time warped, sound dulled. Doctors spoke gently, clinically. Words like complications and non-viable floated in the air without anchoring themselves to meaning. Doris remembered the stillness more than the explanations. The light on the walls, the silence between sentences, the way grief did not arrive as tears, but as emptiness. Then came the second blow. Medical complications meant another pregnancy would likely be fatal. She would never safely carry a child again. The possibility ended before it could be mourned properly. Doris absorbed this information without reaction. She had learned long ago how to receive devastating news without breaking. That skill, once useful, now became dangerous. Jimmy tried to comfort her. He brought flowers, sat with her, spoke about the future, about moving forward, about healing. But grief does not move forward on command. Doris did not want solutions. She wanted acknowledgement. She wanted permission to stop being composed. She did not know how to ask for it. The loss changed everything. Jimmy processed grief through action, through ambition, through redirection. He accepted appointments, responsibilities, roles that required him to be elsewhere, physically and emotionally. Doris turned inward. She withdrew, became quieter, more distant, less present. They began to exist side by side rather than together. The marriage did not explode. It eroded. Doctors prescribed rest, medication, distraction. Friends offered sympathy and then retreated, unsure how to navigate her silence. Society resumed its expectations. Appearances were made, smiles returned, but something fundamental had broken. Doris no longer believed life could be structured into safety. She no longer trusted that effort prevented loss. The system she had been raised within, order, restraint, control, had failed her completely. As the years passed, the marriage became increasingly hollow. Jimmy's political ambitions took precedence. He accepted diplomatic roles that required relocation. Canada felt cold to Doris in ways that had nothing to do with weather. The residences were formal, borrowed, temporary. She felt like a guest in yet another life that was not truly hers. When she returned to Hawaii alone, it was not dramatic. It was inevitable. Their divorce in 1943 was quiet. No scandal, no accusations, no public unraveling, just paperwork. The end of a marriage that had begun with hope and ended in parallel solitude. For Jimmy. Life moved forward. For Doris. Something stopped. After the divorce, Doris returned to Shangri-La, the house overlooking the Pacific that had once represented renewal. Now it felt haunted. The rooms echoed differently. The ocean's rhythm, once soothing, now sounded indifferent. She walked the terraces alone, listening to waves strike volcanic rock with relentless regularity. The world continued. Her grief did not. This was the moment Doris Duke began to change permanently. She did not collapse outwardly. She recalibrated inwardly. Alcohol became routine, not indulgence. Prescription drugs followed. Doctors obliged without hesitation. Her wealth removed friction. Nothing was denied. Sleep became fragmented. Days blurred. She began to seek answers outside reason. Spiritualism offered possibility, not certainty, but hope, the idea that death was not final, that her child might exist somewhere beyond reach. She consulted mediums quietly at first, then more frequently. Some were charlatans, some were sincere. Doris did not care. What mattered was the permission to believe. This period is often misunderstood. People later describe Doris as unstable, erratic, indulgent, but instability was not the cause. It was the consequence. She had lost the one thing she believed could ground her, a child, and with it, the last illusion that life could be controlled through structure. Her upbringing had never taught her how to endure loss. It had taught her how to suppress it. Now suppression turned inward. When people later asked how Doris Duke could have acted the way she did at Rough Point, they often skipped this chapter. They skipped the moment where hope collapsed. They skipped the day her child lived and died without ever becoming a person in the public record. They skipped the realization that her body itself had betrayed her. Because once a person understands that even biology cannot be trusted, control becomes obsession. And obsession, when threatened, becomes dangerous. By the time Doris entered the next phase of her life, new relationships, new dependencies, new illusions, she was no longer the woman who believed marriage could save her. She was someone who had learned that love could vanish overnight, that the future could be erased in a single day, that the world would keep moving regardless. And that lesson stayed with her. It hardened her, it isolated her, and it set the stage for everything that followed. In the next part, we move into the years of intensity, passion, recklessness, and repetition. Because once grief is unprocessed, it does not fade. It looks for somewhere else to go. And Doris Duke would give it plenty of places to land. Download as audio tiếp phần 66 miền từ không vòng vo mà khiến người nghe cuốn hút vào câu chuyện Part 6, Shangri-La, the sanctuary that couldn't save her. Hawaii was not an escape. It was an experiment. Doris Duke went there believing distance could do what time had not. She believed geography might soften grief, that beauty might quiet memory, that a horizon wide enough could dilute pain. She was wrong. But Shangri-La, the estate she built on the edge of the Pacific, would become the most revealing mirror of her inner life, because everything Doris could not say. She tried to build. When Doris first stood on the volcanic rock overlooking the ocean, she felt something unfamiliar. Stillness without judgment. The waves did not care who she was. The wind did not adjust its tone around her fortune. The land offered no expectations, no legacy to carry, no performance to maintain. For a woman who had lived her entire life under surveillance, legal, social, emotional, this felt like oxygen. She began immediately. Shangri-La was not designed as a conventional mansion. It was a world. Islamic geometry, Southeast Asian textures, courtyards that framed light instead of walls, water features that moved slowly, deliberately, as if time itself could be instructed to behave. Doris obsessed over details, tile patterns, door placements, the way sunlight would fall at certain hours. She worked with artisans, historians, architects. She studied cultures where beauty served contemplation rather than dominance. This was not decoration. It was control disguised as serenity. And for a while, it worked. In those early years, Doris seemed focused, calm, purposeful. She woke early, walked the grounds, spent hours reviewing designs. She spoke with clarity about art and history. Visitors remarked that she appeared grounded, almost peaceful, but this calm was narrow. It depended on conditions. Silence, isolation, distance from reminders. The moment those conditions shifted, the equilibrium cracked. At night, the ocean spoke louder. Waves struck rock with relentless consistency. Not violent, persistent. A sound that did not change regardless of mood or meaning. Doris lay awake listening to it, and instead of comfort, she felt confronted. The ocean did not respond to grief. It did not pause. It did not soften. It simply continued, and continuation, after loss, can feel like betrayal. Alcohol entered her life quietly, not as celebration, as maintenance, a drink to sleep, a drink to slow thought, a drink to take the edge off the memories she refused to name. Doctors prescribed medication easily, too easily, sedatives, painkillers, tranquilizers. She asked. They provided. Her wealth removed hesitation. No one questioned dosage. No one pushed back. Why would they? She was Doris Duke. She paid promptly. She did not cause trouble. And so a pattern formed. Drink to rest. Medication to wake. Repeat. This was not collapse. It was managed dysfunction during the day. Doris worked. At night, she drifted. She began to seek meaning in places that did not demand evidence. Spiritualism appealed to her not because she was gullible, but because it offered something science could not. Continuation. The possibility that death was not final, that her child existed somewhere beyond reach. That separation was temporary. She attended seances, consulted mediums. Some were theatrical, some restrained. Doris preferred the quiet ones, the ones who spoke softly, who did not promise certainty. She didn't need proof. She needed permission to hope. Friends noticed changes. Her moods became unpredictable. Some days she was generous, lucid, engaged. Other days withdrawn, irritable, unreachable. Staff learned to read the signs, which door to knock on, which topics to avoid, which silences to respect. Isolation deepened, and isolation, when paired with unchecked power, becomes dangerous. It was during this period that Doris's need for connection began to overpower her need for caution. She had always been lonely. Now loneliness demanded attention. Porfirio Rubirosa entered her life like a spark. He was everything Shangri-La was not: loud, charismatic, restless, dangerous. A Dominican diplomat with movie star looks and a reputation that preceded him. Rubirosa was magnetic. He thrived on attention. He knew how to make people feel seen, especially women who were accustomed to being admired but not desired. He did not treat Doris like a fragile heiress. He treated her like a conquest, and that distinction mattered. Their relationship moved quickly, too quickly. Travel, parties, headlines. Rubirosa knew how to perform for the press. He understood optics, glamour, spectacle. Doris found herself pulled back into a world she had tried to escape. But this time, the spotlight felt intoxicating rather than oppressive. She was not being watched alone. She was being watched with someone, and for a woman who had spent her life isolated by wealth. That felt like belonging. The warnings came immediately. Friends cautioned her. Advisors hesitated. Trustees grew uneasy. Rubirosa's history was well known. Wealthy women, extravagant gifts, short-lived marriages. Doris dismissed the concerns. Not because she didn't understand them, but because understanding them would require admitting she was vulnerable. And Doris Duke did not see herself as vulnerable. She saw herself as overdue. They married in 1947. The press devoured it. The heiress and the diplomat, glamour and money, passion and power, for a time. It looked like triumph, but beneath the surface, the same patterns repeated. Rubirosa loved intensity, not stability. He disappeared frequently. His fidelity was questionable. His appetite for attention, for luxury, for validation was endless. Doris responded the only way she knew how. She gave money, gifts, access. She bought him expensive cars, jewelry, even a converted military aircraft, an act so extravagant it baffled observers. To outsiders, it looked like excess. To Doris, it was maintenance, if she gave enough. Maybe he would stay. He didn't. The marriage eroded quickly. Arguments replaced affection. Absences grew longer. Rumors louder. Doris felt the familiar tightening in her chest. The sensation she had known since childhood. Abandonment. Again. And once again. She had no framework to process it safely. Their divorce in 1951 was brutal in its implications, even if polite in execution. Rubirosa left with a substantial settlement. Doris was left with confirmation of her deepest fear. That connection, once achieved, would always cost her something irretrievable: trust, dignity, control. After Rubirosa, Doris retreated more deeply than ever before. She returned to Shangri-La. But the sanctuary had changed. The walls were the same, the view unchanged, but the illusion was gone. Beauty had failed her. Love had failed her. Structure had failed her. Only control remained. She became increasingly suspicious of those around her. Motives were questioned, loyalty tested. She withdrew from social life almost entirely, choosing instead to focus on projects she could manage alone. Art collecting intensified, architecture, design. anything that responded predictably to input. Plants grew when watered. Stones stayed where placed. Objects did not leave unless moved. People were not so reliable. Substance use deepened. Alcohol blurred edges. Medications softened anxiety. Doctors continued to comply. Staff continued to adapt. No intervention occurred. Why would it? She was functional. She was wealthy. She was private. And privacy, when absolute, is a shield against accountability. This is where the narrative often becomes simplistic. People like to label Doris Duke as unstable, erratic, indulgent. But those labels miss the point. She was unanchored. A person raised without emotional scaffolding, stripped of the possibility of motherhood, betrayed repeatedly in intimate relationships, and insulated from consequence by wealth. She did not lack intelligence, she lacked containment. When Doris eventually returned more frequently to places like Rough Point, it was not nostalgia, it was consolidation. Her world was narrowing. She trusted fewer people. She tolerated less unpredictability. She demanded more control. And control, once it becomes survival, reacts violently to threat. Eduardo Terrell entered her life during this narrowing. He was calm, competent, grounded. He worked with her art collections, her design projects. He did not push, did not demand, did not dramatize. He was reliable, and reliability, to someone like Doris Duke, is intoxicating because it feels like safety. For years, Eduardo existed within her orbit without disturbing it, until the day he decided to leave. And that decision, ordinary to him, collided with decades of unresolved loss, obsession, dependency, and fear. The sanctuary had failed. The marriage had failed. The illusions had failed. All that remained was a woman who had learned one thing very well: never let go first. And that lesson, carried too long, would lead her back to a gate she could not open without destroying something. By the early 1950s, Doris Duke's world had narrowed to something deceptively small. She still owned multiple estates. She still commanded unimaginable wealth. She still funded institutions, collected rare art, and shaped environments with precision. But internally, her life had compressed. Fewer people, fewer variables, fewer places where she felt remotely safe. This narrowing did not happen suddenly. It happened the way pressure builds underground, silently, invisibly, until the structure above it can no longer hold. After her divorce from Porfirio Rubirosa, Doris did not seek romance. She sought stability. The passion that had once drawn her toward intensity now frightened her. She had learned, painfully, that charm dissolved under scrutiny. That desire evaporated when tested by time. What she wanted now was predictability, calm, someone who did not excite her, but did not abandon her either. She wanted someone who stayed. This is where people often misunderstand Doris Duke. They assume that because she had money, she had options, endless choices, endless companionship. But wealth does not expand emotional choice. It contracts it. It filters people through a lens of motive and suspicion until the field is almost empty. By this point in her life, Doris trusted almost no one, and trust, once rare, becomes precious, dangerously precious. Her days followed strict patterns. Mornings were quiet. She preferred early hours. Before staff movement disrupted the stillness, she drank coffee alone, often in silence, reviewing plans, correspondence, architectural drawings. Control soothed her. Order reassured her. Afternoons were for projects, art acquisitions, garden development. Meetings kept intentionally brief. Doris disliked prolonged conversation. She wanted efficiency, not intimacy. Evenings were the most difficult. That was when memory crept in. That was when alcohol moved from background to foreground. Doctors continued prescribing without resistance. Sedatives to sleep, stimulants to wake, painkillers to smooth the transitions. No one confronted her patterns. No one insisted on boundaries. Doris had reached a level of wealth where concern became optional, and without boundaries, behavior drifts. It was during this period that Doris's need for emotional anchors intensified. She had learned that lovers left, husbands left, even dreams left. What she needed now was someone whose role was defined, someone whose presence was not threatened by passion or ambition, someone whose life fit neatly into hers. This is why Eduardo Terrell mattered. Eduardo did not arrive dramatically. He was not loud. He was not glamorous. He did not command attention. He worked. He listened. He showed up when expected and left when appropriate. He respected boundaries, and for Doris Duke, that respect was intoxicating. Eduardo worked closely with Doris on her art collections and design projects. He had taste, but not ego, knowledge, but not arrogance. He spoke when necessary and stayed quiet when it mattered. He did not ask for access. He earned it, over time. He became a constant presence, traveling with her between properties, overseeing installations, advising on acquisitions. Doris began to rely on him not just professionally, but emotionally. He became part of her routine, and routines, for someone like Doris, equaled safety. The relationship was not romantic in the traditional sense, but it was intimate. They spent long hours together, shared private spaces, discussed ideas, aesthetics, logistics. Eduardo understood her preferences, her rhythms, her silences. He knew when not to speak. That skill is rare, and it creates attachment. For Doris, Eduardo represented something she had never truly had: reliable proximity without demand. He did not want her money. He did not want her name. He did not want her body. He wanted to work, and that made him feel safe. But safety, once internalized as survival, becomes non-negotiable. As years passed, Doris's world continued to constrict. She spent less time in public. She avoided social events unless absolutely necessary. Her circle shrank. People drifted away, not because she pushed them out overtly, but because she did not pull them in. Isolation hardened into habit, habit into preference, preference into dependency. Doris trusted Eduardo because he did not threaten her equilibrium, but dependency creates a hidden danger. It transfers power without noticing. Doris began to structure her days around Eduardo's presence. His absence unsettled her. His availability reassured her. When he traveled or worked elsewhere, she felt destabilized. She did not articulate this. She did not even fully recognize it. But her reactions began to reveal it. When Eduardo mentioned opportunities outside her orbit, Doris responded with subtle resistance. She framed it as concern, as practicality, as logistics. But beneath those rationalizations lay something far older and far more volatile. Fear. Fear of loss. Fear of repetition. Fear that once again, someone she depended on would leave. This fear did not express itself as vulnerability. It expressed itself as control. Doris asked more questions, required more updates, expected more availability. She framed these expectations as reasonable. After all, she was his employer, and technically, she was, but emotionally, something else was happening. The professional boundary was eroding. Eduardo noticed the shift. He became more cautious, more measured. He respected Doris, But he also recognized the imbalance forming. He was building a career. He wanted autonomy. And eventually, he decided he needed to leave, to Eduardo. This decision was rational. He had opportunities in Hollywood, design work, production roles, creative independence. He had spent years orbiting Doris Duke's life. Now he wanted one of his own. He did not see departure as betrayal. He saw it as growth. Doris did not. By the time Eduardo prepared to tell her, Doris was already fragile. Years of isolation, unaddressed dependency, substance use managed but persistent, a world view shaped by abandonment. She had built a world small enough to control. Now something inside it was moving. Their conversation at Rough Point on October 6, 1966, did not begin explosively. It began quietly. Eduardo explained his plans carefully. He expressed gratitude, respect, appreciation. He likely believed this would soften the blow. It didn't. To Doris, the words landed like a verdict. Leaving again. Another person choosing a future that did not include her. Another anchor lifting itself from the ground. She did not hear ambition. She heard abandonment. Accounts differ on how the conversation escalated. Some suggest raised voices. Others insist it remained controlled. Doris herself later described distress, but not rage. But emotional escalation does not require shouting. Sometimes it manifests as tightening, as fixation, as a narrowing of perception. Doris had spent a lifetime learning how to suppress reaction. That suppression did not eliminate emotion. It concentrated it. And when Eduardo said he was leaving, decades of unprocessed loss surged forward at once. Her father, her child, her marriages, her illusions. All of it collapsed into a single moment. They walked together toward the car. The rain had begun to fall. The driveway glistened under the exterior lights. The iron gate stood closed, tall and immovable. Eduardo stepped out to open it. This detail matters, because it placed him outside the vehicle. It placed Doris alone behind the wheel, and it placed years of emotional imbalance into a position of physical consequence. When people later debated whether Doris Duke intended to harm Eduardo Terrell, they focused on the wrong thing. They focused on intent. Intent is clean. This moment was not. What mattered was state of mind, and Doris Duke's state of mind had been deteriorating for years. She later said her foot slipped, that she meant to ease the car forward, that she panicked. Those statements may even be true, but panic does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs when emotional load exceeds capacity, and Doris Duke had been carrying too much for too long. This is the moment where dependency reveals its danger, because when someone becomes essential to emotional survival, their departure feels catastrophic, and catastrophic feelings override caution, override proportion, override restraint. Eduardo Terrell did not know he was standing at the center of decades of unresolved grief. He thought he was opening a gate. Doris Duke did not know she was about to cross a line that could never be erased. She thought she was preventing another loss. What happened next lasted only seconds, but those seconds were shaped by an entire lifetime, and once metal met stone, once momentum replaced intention, once the gate became a barrier instead of an object, there was no more room for interpretation, only consequence. In the next part, we will enter that night fully, the rain, the gate, the collision, the aftermath, because everything Doris Duke had been avoiding for decades arrived at once. And this time, money could not reverse physics. Only silence would try. The rain did not fall violently that night. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't dramatic. There was no thunder to warn anyone that something irreversible was about to happen. It was the kind of rain people forget. Steady, cold, persistent. The kind that slicks stone without announcing itself. The kind that turns familiar ground into something subtly dangerous. October 6, 1966. Rough Point, Newport, Rhode Island. An estate built to withstand centuries of wind and salt now sat quietly under low clouds. Its iron gate closed, its driveway reflecting the yellow glow of exterior lamps. The Atlantic churned below the cliffs, unseen but audible, its rhythm constant, indifferent. Inside the house, the atmosphere had shifted hours earlier. Eduardo Terrell did not come to Rough Point intending to argue. He had made this decision carefully. He had rehearsed his words. He understood Doris Duke well enough to know that abruptness would be unwise. He had waited for a moment that felt appropriate. Calm, contained. There was no perfect time. There never is. Eduardo had spent years inside Doris Duke's orbit. He knew her routines, her silences, her moods. He had seen her generosity and her volatility. He had witnessed how deeply she relied on familiarity and how badly she reacted to disruption. But he also knew something else. If he didn't leave now, he never would. Hollywood offered him something Doris could not. A future that belonged to him alone. Creative autonomy. Distance from wealth that distorted every relationship. A chance to exist without being absorbed. Leaving was not rejection. It was survival. The conversation began quietly. Doris listened at first. She always did. She rarely interrupted. Her face gave little away. Years of composure had trained her muscles not to betray emotion. Eduardo explained his plans. He spoke respectfully. He thanked her. He acknowledged the opportunities she had provided. From the outside, it looked civil. From the inside, something was tightening. Doris did not hear gratitude. She heard finality. People later debated whether the argument was heated, raised voices, or calm tones, but escalation does not require volume. Sometimes it happens when the mind begins to narrow, when options disappear, when perception collapses inward. Doris Duke had experienced this narrowing before, after her father's death, after the loss of her child, after her divorces. Each time, she had retreated. Each time, she had survived by shrinking her world. Now the world she had shrunk was being threatened again. And this time, she had no intention of retreating. She did not plead. She did not cry. She questioned. Why now? Why Hollywood? Why leave? Eduardo answered patiently. He did not accuse. He did not attack. He explained. Explanation was not what Doris needed. She needed certainty, and certainty was exactly what she was losing. When they walked toward the car, the decision had already been made, not consciously, emotionally. Once movement begins, reversal becomes harder. The station wagon waited near the gate, engine running. Rain tapped lightly against metal and stone. The driveway glistened. Eduardo moved instinctively toward the gate. He had opened it countless times before. It was routine. He did not hesitate. Doris slid into the driver's seat. This detail would later become central. She was alone. No one else in the vehicle. No one to interrupt. No one to recalibrate. She later said she wanted to spare Eduardo the trouble of returning to the car, that she planned to inch forward once the gate opened. That explanation sounded reasonable, almost mundane, which is precisely why it unsettled so many people. As Eduardo reached the gate, he turned his back to the car. Rain slicked the stones beneath his shoes. The iron bars were heavy, old, resistant. He began to pull. Inside the vehicle, Doris waited, her hands on the wheel, her foot hovering. She was not thinking about physics. She was thinking about loss. She was thinking about how many times she had been left behind. She was thinking about how small her world had become, and how it was about to become smaller still. What happened next unfolded in seconds, seconds shaped by decades. According to Doris, her foot slipped. She said she pressed the accelerator instead of the brake. The car lurched forward, not gently, not gradually. It surged. The sound was sharp. Metal striking metal, glass shattering. A body pinned between steel and stone. Neighbors later described hearing a crash that did not sound like a bump. It sounded like force. Eduardo Terrell was crushed against the gate. The impact was devastating. There was no time to move, no time to shout, no time to understand what was happening. His body absorbed the collision. The car stopped. The rain continued. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of water hitting stone. Staff arrived quickly. Someone screamed. Someone ran for help. Emergency services were called. Doris remained in the vehicle, shaking, disoriented. She did not flee. She did not attempt to hide what had happened. But shock and innocence are not the same thing. And shock can coexist with guilt. Eduardo was rushed to the hospital. He did not survive. Cause of death: massive trauma. Pinned between the vehicle and the gate. Crushed. By the time police arrived, the scene had already begun to calcify into narrative. An accident, a tragic mistake, a foot slipping, a moment of panic. But the physical evidence told a more complicated story. The distance the car traveled, the force of impact, the damage to the gate, the placement of the vehicle, tire marks on wet stone. These details did not disappear. They were measured, documented, questioned, quietly. Yet something else was present that night. Something that altered the trajectory of every subsequent decision. Doris Duke. She was not an ordinary witness. She was not an ordinary driver. She was one of the wealthiest women in America, a philanthropist, a benefactor, a name embedded in Newport's institutions. Her presence alone changed the atmosphere. Police questioned her carefully, respectfully. She appeared shaken, distraught. She repeated her explanation. Her foot slipped. She panicked. She did not intend to harm anyone. No one accused her outright, not that night, but questions surfaced. Privately, professionally, quietly. Why was the engine running? Why did the vehicle accelerate with such force? Why were the tire marks inconsistent with a gentle movement? Why did the gate sustain damage suggesting impact rather than pressure? These questions did not lead to confrontation. They led to silence. Eduardo Terrell's family was devastated. He had been building a future. Hollywood was not a dream. It was a trajectory. And now he was gone, crushed at the gate of a woman whose wealth could erase almost anything. Within days, lawyers became involved. Statements were refined. Language was chosen carefully. The word accident appeared repeatedly. It softened everything it touched. A wrongful death claim was filed. It did not go to trial. It was settled quietly. The amount was substantial. But money does not equate to justice. It equates to closure, forced or otherwise. Doris Duke was never charged. No indictment, no trial, no courtroom. The investigation faded, officially unresolved, practically abandoned. Newport moved on. Charities continued receiving donations. Institutions benefited from Doris's generosity. Doors remained open, but the night at the gate did not disappear. It transformed. It became rumor, whisper, speculation. Some believed Doris panicked, a tragic lapse, an accident fueled by emotional distress. Others believed something darker, a moment of rage, of control lost. of intent disguised as mistake. Doris herself never altered her story, never elaborated, never defended beyond repetition. Her silence became impenetrable. After Rough Point, she changed, more withdrawn, more erratic. Her substance use deepened, her isolation hardened. She avoided Newport, avoided questions, avoided memory. But avoidance does not erase impact. It preserves it. The gate remained. The iron bars still bore marks. The driveway still held the shape of that night. Years later, investigators would revisit the case. Journalists would re-examine evidence. Friends would offer contradictory accounts. But the truth never settled. It hovered, unresolved, because truth requires confrontation, and confrontation requires power to be challenged. That night, power was not challenged, it was deferred. Doris Duke lived the rest of her life inside that deferral. A woman who had always been protected by systems now protected herself with silence. She continued her philanthropy, her art, her routines, but something essential had shifted. She was no longer simply lonely. She was haunted. The night at the gate did not end when the rain stopped. It echoed forward, into every quiet room, every sleepless night, every relationship she avoided. In the next part, we will follow the aftermath, the investigation that wasn't, the silence that replaced accountability, the way money bends outcomes without ever touching the truth. Because the most disturbing part of this story is not what happened at Rough Point. It's what didn't happen afterward, and what that says about power in America. The rain stopped before the questions did. At Rough Point, dawn arrived without ceremony. The clouds lifted slowly from the Atlantic, revealing a coastline that looked unchanged, cliffs intact, waves steady, iron gates standing where it always had. If someone had driven past that morning without knowing, they would have seen nothing unusual, no broken ground, no tape, no warning that a life had ended there hours earlier. But inside the estate, nothing was the same. In the days following Eduardo Terrell's death, Newport entered a strange state of restraint. Not denial, not outrage, restraint. Police reports were written carefully. Language mattered. Words were chosen not for clarity, but for containment. Statements described a tragic accident, a moment of panic, an unfortunate misstep. Each phrase softened the event, sanding down the violence until it sounded survivable. It wasn't. Eduardo had been crushed against iron and stone. There was no ambiguity about the outcome, only about the cause, and ambiguity, when paired with influence, is powerful. Doris Duke did not give interviews. She did not hold a press conference. She did not publicly mourn. She remained behind walls, surrounded by lawyers, advisors, and staff who understood one thing instinctively: nothing must escalate. Silence was not just protection, it was strategy. Investigators visited Rough Point again. They measured distances, photographed damage, noted tire marks. They examined the gate closely, its bent metal, the scarring where force had been applied. They took statements from staff, from neighbors, from emergency responders, privately. Doubt circulated, quietly, professionally. But doubt requires traction to become action, and traction was missing. Doris Duke was not just a private citizen. She was one of Newport's most significant benefactors. Her donations supported hospitals, museums, charities, preservation efforts. Her name carried weight in rooms where decisions were made. Her absence from public life did not diminish her influence. It concentrated it. No one wanted to be the person who turned a tragic accident into a public confrontation. No one wanted to test how far power extended. Eduardo Terrell's family wanted answers. They wanted accountability. They wanted acknowledgement that what had happened was not simply unfortunate, but questionable. They filed a wrongful death suit. This mattered, because lawsuits require evidence. They require narratives to be tested. They require facts to be spoken aloud. The case never reached a courtroom. It ended quietly. A settlement was reached, substantial, confidential, final. Money changed hands. The legal threat evaporated, and with it, the only mechanism that could have forced truth into daylight. This is where the story turns uncomfortable. Because settlements are not verdicts. They are resolutions without conclusions. They close doors without opening them. They end conflict without answering questions. And they leave behind a residue of uncertainty that never quite settles for Doris Duke. The settlement was not an admission of guilt. It was insurance. Insurance against scrutiny. Insurance against unpredictability. Insurance against the one thing she feared more than loss: exposure. Newspapers reported the settlement briefly. The language was restrained. The story faded. Another tragedy resolved. Another headline replaced. But among investigators, journalists, and those who had seen the physical evidence, the doubts did not fade. They lingered. Why had the car accelerated with such force? Why were the tire marks inconsistent with a gentle roll? Why did the damage to the gate suggest impact rather than pressure? Why did the investigation slow so quickly? There were no definitive answers. Only speculation, and speculation thrives in silence. Doris Duke returned to her life, if it could still be called that. She avoided Newport whenever possible. When she did return, she stayed briefly. Staff noticed changes. Her temper shortened. Her patience thinned. Her moods became unpredictable. She drank more, took more medication, slept less. Those close to her described a woman hollowed out by something she would not name. She did not speak of Eduardo, ever. Not in grief, not in anger, not in reflection. It was as if erasing his name could erase the night. But erasure has a cost. Memory does not disappear when ignored. It distorts. Over the following years, Doris became increasingly isolated. She retreated from public life almost entirely. Philanthropy continued, but quietly, mechanically. Donations were made without ceremony. Her foundations operated with minimal oversight from her. She lived in fragments, moving between properties, rarely staying long, never settling. Friends drifted away, some out of discomfort, some out of fear, some because Doris no longer tolerated unpredictability. Her world grew smaller, more controlled, more brittle. Journalists occasionally revisited the case. Each time, the same obstacles appeared. No new evidence, no cooperation, no official reopening. The gate remained closed, in private. Speculation hardened. Some believed Doris had panicked. A tragic mistake. A moment of loss of control. Others believed something more deliberate had occurred. A surge of rage. A refusal to let go. A final attempt to assert control over abandonment. The truth lay somewhere beyond reach, because truth requires testimony, and Doris Duke never testified. As years passed, the story transformed, from news to rumor, from rumor to legend, from legend to cautionary tale. Doris Duke lived long enough to see herself become a symbol, not just of wealth, but of what wealth can prevent: accountability. Her final years were marked by further instability. Substance use worsened. Paranoia crept in. She trusted almost no one. Her health declined. When she died in 1993, the public response was muted, respectful, curated. She was remembered as a philanthropist, an art collector, a benefactor. The night at Rough Point was mentioned only obliquely, if at all. Her ashes were scattered at sea. A final dispersal. No marker, no grave, no place to return to. But the questions did not die with her. They drifted, like ash. The gate at Rough Point still stands. Visitors still pass by. Some know. Most do not. And that is perhaps the most unsettling part. Not that a man died. Not that a woman may have escaped consequence. But that the system allowed it. That power bent process. That silence replaced truth. In the final part, we will confront what remains, legacy, meaning, and the uncomfortable realization that some stories never resolve, not because answers don't exist, but because they are buried deliberately, because the gate did not close by accident. It was closed by design, and once closed, it stayed that way, forever. The ocean does not keep records. It takes what it's given and moves on, wave after wave, erasing edges, smoothing evidence, refusing memory. When Doris Duke's ashes were scattered into the Pacific, there was no reckoning, no verdict, no final word. Just water, closing over gray dust, and a horizon that did not look back. But land remembers, stone remembers, iron remembers. And at Rough Point, the gate still stands. After Eduardo Terrell's death, the world did what it always does when power demands quiet. It complied. There was no public trial because trials create transcripts. There was no cross-examination because questions create risk. There was no verdict because verdicts create accountability. Instead, there was a settlement, a pause, a fading, and fading is not forgetting. It's postponing. In the years that followed, Doris Duke lived as if the night at the gate were sealed behind her eyes, present but unreachable, heavy but unspoken. She did not confess. She did not clarify. She did not deny beyond repetition. She did what she had learned to do since childhood. She managed the perimeter. Her perimeter grew smaller. She withdrew from social life almost entirely. When she appeared, it was controlled, brief, and distant. She avoided Newport, avoided old routes, avoided places where memory might rise uninvited. Staff adapted to a new version of her, more suspicious, less tolerant, quick to anger, quicker to retreat. Alcohol remained a constant companion. Medication filled the spaces alcohol couldn't. Doctors changed, prescriptions did not. She slept in fragments. She woke unsettled. She paced at night in houses too large to feel safe. Isolation hardened into identity. People who knew her noticed a shift that could not be explained by age alone. She startled easily. She demanded certainty. She mistrusted coincidence. Doors were checked twice. Schedules tightened. Unfamiliar faces were discouraged. Her world was no longer built for living. It was built for containment, and containment has a cost. Journalists came and went over the years, drawn by the same gravity that pulls metal filings toward a magnet. Unanswered questions. They requested interviews, filed records requests, walked the driveway at Rough Point, studied photographs of the gate, compared measurements, replayed the physics. Some believed the official story could be true. Panic, a slip, a fatal mistake amplified by bad timing and wet stone. Others did not. They pointed to force, to distance, to damage. They asked why the investigation slowed, why evidence never escalated into confrontation, why a woman with Doris Duke's wealth and influence was never required to explain her actions under oath. They asked, and they received silence. Silence is not neutral. Silence favors the powerful. And Doris Duke was powerful until the end. As her health declined, control became obsession. She revised wills, changed beneficiaries, cut people out, pulled others close. Paranoia flickered. Sometimes it burned. She accused, then retracted, trusted, then distrusted. Relationships could not stabilize under the weight of her vigilance. The world had taught her a lesson she could not unlearn. Nothing stays unless you hold it. But holding too tightly breaks things. When she died in 1993, there was no dramatic reckoning, only logistics. Estates were settled, foundations continued, assets were distributed, lawyers did their work. Institutions released statements praising her generosity, her taste, her impact. The night at Rough Point was mentioned carefully, if at all. A footnote, a complication, a tragedy resolved. And yet, the questions persisted because they were never answered, only muted. Did Doris Duke intend to kill Eduardo Terrell? No one can prove that. But intention is not the only measure of responsibility. There is also foreseeability. There is control. There is power. And there is what happens when those things converge in a moment of emotional collapse. What can be said, without speculation, is this. A man died pinned between iron and stone. A car accelerated with force. Physical evidence raised questions. Legal mechanisms were neutralized by money. The person behind the wheel never faced a public accounting. Everything else exists in the space between facts and fear. The most unsettling truth of this story is not whether Doris Duke was guilty in a legal sense. It is that the system never forced the question. Justice, in its truest form, requires friction. It requires discomfort. It requires power to be challenged by process. That did not happen here. Instead, there was deference. And deference is the quiet currency of privilege. The gate at Rough Point remains closed not because it cannot be opened, but because it never had to be. No court demanded it, no jury required it, no verdict unlocked it. The gate stands as a symbol not of one woman's tragedy, but of a structure that bends when wealth leans on it. Doris Duke was not born cruel. She was not raised to harm. She was shaped by systems that prioritized preservation over humanity, control over connection, silence over truth. Those systems did not create the night at the gate, but they made it survivable for her and fatal for someone else. This is where the story ends, not with certainty, but with consequence, not with answers, but with an understanding that power does not need innocence to prevail. It needs access. Some stories resolve in courtrooms, others resolve in whispers, and some, like this one, never resolve at all. They linger, they ask, they wait, like an iron gate on a wet driveway, under a light that never quite goes out, holding a question that no amount of money could ever fully bury. What happens when the truth is less powerful than the person who controls it? The ocean has already moved on, but the gate is still there, and it always will be.